Morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. And thank you, Catherine, and also Debbie, for the enormous amount of work that goes into this conference and having the foresight and vision to set something like this up, which is pretty impressive under current conditions in the world. So, as Catherine mentioned, I'm an SU person. I work at the Institute for National Security and Counterterrorism. We call it INSCIT. It's a joint institute between Maxwell and the law school. So you'll see sort of security and law emphases in my work. But what I'm going to do today is talk to you a little bit about merging some of the empirical conflict inquiry, that literature from empirical conflict studies, with conflict management conversations. So I'm going to sort of hit you over the head today with empirics from a global perspective, and you can sort of, maybe we can see the ways in which these traditions are going to be kind of engaging each other and offering some insights. So my work generally is at the intersection of culture and security. I actually have a humanities background, so I'm an international security specialist with a culture studies background. My work is basically encapsulated in this graphic, which is that I look at the way in which armed conflict trends are changing globally and the way that those are interacting with changing conflict norms. So I'm interested in the intersection of norms and conflict patterns, okay? And I actually work across the spectrum here, the conflict spectrum. So I work in irregular warfare. I also work with non-state actors in research. And I'm also working with interstate conflicts as well. So some just key term definitions, which it sounds like you discussed fairly thoroughly this morning. Many of these are attributable to Lou, as we all know. I will say one thing, just to engage the Q&A from this morning. I like the word conflict transformation. I like it for a lot of reasons that I think will come out in my presentation. But one thing I would like to say from a kind of presentist, a historical presentist perspective, is that the current state of conflict dynamics in the world are very much characterized by disruption. Everything's changing. The complexity of conflict is growing enormously. So I particularly like the word conflict transformation because I think it can analytically handle the dynamism of global conflict trends. So I think it's a particularly useful word right now, not just in its relationship with conflict management studies, but in terms of describing the historicity that we're dealing with. So that's all old hat for everybody. Why might we want to bridge conflict studies with empirical conflict inquiry? Here are a couple of reasons, and I'm not going to go through them. There are some just very simple reasons like basic science and strengthening practice, right? If you have a fact basis or an evidentiary basis for your practice, it tends to strengthen your practice, right? Social science kind of cardinal presupposition, right? But the other reason I think is very important are these last two, and that is we have finite resources in the world today for conflict intervention and management. And I think that if you can take a look at some of the meta-national, big and meta-national trends that are going on, it gives a certain kind of focus and shape to where you're going to prioritize your investments. And right now, when investments are low, what's the cost of the post 9/11 wars for the United States alone? Like, what's the running number? $3 trillion now, right? So while resources are low, it's a very good time to think about priorities in terms of investment and how you analytically and empirically justify or rationalize those priorities. I also think, and this is the last point on the slide, I don't know if you can see it, but one nice aspect of looking at big data and empirical data with respect to conflict inquiry is that it helps correct some of our assumptions and myths. And I have to say that in some ways, some of our normative assumptions and myths are the ones that are most in need of correcting. So this idea, right, that, what is it? The road to hell is paved with good intentions or something, right? This kind of famous idiom or whatever. But there is something to that. So the empirical baseline helps correct even our best intentioned assumptions, and which may turn out to be myths, some of them. One I'm going to talk about. Okay, so just to give you a really quick zip through the empirical conflict literature, there are sort of 5 cardinal truths in the quantitative study of conflict. There is the declinist thesis, and some of you know this empirically or from encountering it in other disciplinary literatures, and that's the idea that since World War II, can everybody hear me okay? Okay, good. Since World War II, interstate war and battle deaths have been steadily declining, right? A fairly easily demonstrated kind of thesis, pretty wide basis of consensus, various data sets from different initiatives, Correlates of War, Uppsala Prio, armed conflict data, and many others kind of demonstrating the same kind of trend. So that's the good news, so to speak. The bad news is that at the same time, there's been a rise of interstate conflict, civil war kinds of conflict. And I put a couple slides just so you could kind of see these things. So this is 46 to 2014. The green is the Civil War. The blues are the colonial wars and interstate wars. So you can clearly see that light blue decline on the international interstate war side, right? And this is Uppsala data. So those are kind of 2 cardinal truths in quantitative study of conflict. Third, greed or grievance, a long-standing debate throughout the 80s and 90s. And we sort of shook out on greed, right? So yes, there are politics that are involved, but the economic roots of war are pretty significant, right? So the way I sort of square that debate is to talk about the political economic roots of armed conflict. And I know when we're talking about conflict, many of us are not talking about violence. I'm always talking about violence. I'm talking about armed conflict and political violence in all of these slides, okay, and in my research in general. Okay, a 4th kind of cardinal truth in empirical studies is the increasing mobilization of identity sectarians in the context of civil war. And these are largely talked about in terms of ethnic sectarianisms and ethnic salience of identity. But this is kind of more emergent and recent research, and we're finding that there's a lot of different definitions of ethnicity. People still separate ethnicity and race as if race is a viable category. I don't know why we do this at the empirical level. Nationality, where does that come into play? How do we actually code and define ethnicity? Is it in particular groups, or is it differences between groups? But we can generally say that identity, especially along lines of ethnicity, is being increasingly mobilized as a sectarian force in civil wars in the period that we're talking about, in the post-World War period. Okay, last truth, and this is more of an emergent truth than a cardinal truth, and I think this is coming out of Fearon and Layton's research at Stanford. They have 2 new essays about this, relatively new, 2012, 2014. Very worth looking at. And so basically, they're making a claim that I think is very relevant for our work today at this conference, and that is that conflicts end. So if you look at, so there's an anti-persistence character to armed conflicts, international and non-international and interstate. So if you look at conflicts taking a 200-year slice, so the last 200 years, so going into the post-war period as well, right, going into the 19th century as well, what we see is that conflicts don't last. They end. Now, there are some interesting dynamics to how and why conflicts don't persist. And we can talk more about that if people are interested. But one of the things that this does, I think, is it adds specificity, historicity, and empirics to this kind of myth, this folklore wisdom we have that there are deep historical roots to many conflicts, particularly in conflict-prone regions, which are traditionally defined as Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, right? So this notion that there are deep historical roots, oh, thank you. The idea that there are deep historical roots is a kind of conceit or convention that we use, and the empirics are beginning to chip away at that. especially on the long term. Okay, just some slides just to show you what some of this stuff looks like. Battle deaths and decline. I don't know if I need, I think those are pretty self-explanatory, so I won't go any further there. Now, I do want to make a couple points about emerging trends and insights. Now, we've been talking largely about organized armed conflict, whether it's state actors or non-state actors or both, right? Now, let's switch for a second to terrorism as a kind of species of political violence. And I want to just make a couple points about emerging trends that go along with some of the trends we just talked about. Now, I'm not calling these cardinal truths, even though the first one obviously is. But they're a little bit more contested, and the research on terrorism studies, especially on the big data side, on the meta-national large N data side, is a little more emergent, a little less formed. So anyway, terrorism is on the rise. It's confined to some of the top producing countries. We can take a look at those together: Pakistan, Iraq, some of the post-conflict nations, et cetera. So it looks like this, 1970 to 2013, for total terrorist incidents across the world. Okay. Deaths, global deaths from terrorism. Now, this has been disaggregated for particular countries, so you can see their share of the deaths from terrorism. So you see some of these hot button countries that I mentioned before: Iraq, Nigeria, Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan. But you can see, in any case, the whole world, the numbers jumping up, right, for deaths from terrorism. And then these are concentration areas, regions, in which the intensity of terrorist forms of political violence are high. And the red is, it goes like this. The red is the highest down to the green. Okay, so just to give you some orientation. So back to my points here. Terrorism is on the rise globally. Terrorism behaves differently than armed conflict, both regular and irregular. It doesn't have, what we're finding in the empirics is that it doesn't have the economic roots that other forms of armed conflict does. So it actually is very different than armed conflict in terms of its behavior. Second of all, there's lots of regional variety, and one or two or cluster nations can skew the whole global board. So it's got like very strange peaks and troughs that are quite different. And then the third point, and I can't emphasize this third point enough, and I think it's a little bit of a dereliction of duty for us in the social sciences who are working in security issues to have not flagged this earlier. And that is religious hostilities and persecution in general by states and by other non-state actors are significantly on the rise today. So they're higher. 2014 was the high point historically since these numbers have been tracked. And there are data sets. I list all my data sets at the end of the slide, so I'm happy to talk about those or share them. But so if we take a look at, I think I gave you a couple of maps on religion. So this is Pew data. They have a very interesting data set and survey that they run on this question of religious hostilities. It includes both, as I said, state repression and individual and non-state persecution of religious minorities. So you can see where the levels of social hostilities, including both those categories that I just mentioned, government and non-government actors, where they're high, right? And as I said before, they're an all-time high. Then you can take a look at restrictions that are rising cross-regionally, most cross-regionally, according to government restrictions on religion. And then you can see the number of countries over here to the right where religious groups are being actively harassed, often through violence. And so these are the groups, and each of these groups are big, broad groups. There's many, many little groups in each of those big categories, right? But those are the states, those are the documented number of states where this kind of harassment is going on. So, why should we care about religion as an issue in thinking about the kind of global empirics of conflict and the patterns of conflict? One important reason, and we could talk for hours about these, but I'm just going to mention maybe just one important reason, and that is we're kind of witnessing this rising sectarianism globally Thank you. Including just various forms of discrimination that drill down, that are pretty specific. So Ahmadi, for instance, in Pakistan are now getting singled out. Baha'i in Iran are getting singled out. Now, some of this has been going on for a while, but it's really ratcheting up. So we're seeing this rising sectarianism with religious identity as a salient point of identity across the world, and justifications for violence according to religious identity. And these trends are literally destabilizing many regions and places in a way that I really don't think we're capturing in the social science literature and the interdisciplinary literature. Don't forget, we've got 65 million people who are on the move today, both forced migrants and internally displaced people. Many of them are citing religious discrimination and religious violence as the reason that they're on the move. Yes, it is armed conflict as well, but in many cases it has a religious tint to it or a religious identity targeting aspect to it. So anyway, it's something for us to think about. Let's see, I wonder, just have a couple more minutes here, so I wonder what else I should sort of tell you. Maybe I'll try to wrap up about how this is all connected, how these issues that I'm kind of flagging for you is connected to how we think about conflict transformation. Maybe I'll try to do that. So a couple of issues that are kind of on my mind. One is that we need to think more systematically about our normative approaches to conflict management and conflict transformation. We need, in my view, to be kind of radically nonpartisan about these issue and inquiry areas. And then what we're not, that we find ourselves potentially getting included in the conflict dynamics themselves. There's nothing better than certain sectarian groups like to do than to have political elites, international political elites, weigh in and take a side in their conflict. So we may be unwittingly being part of this right now without realizing it. And I think if you look at the global picture and see how much some of these, especially identity-based categories, are rising and fueling and becoming part of narratives of violent conflict, I think it's easier to kind of get some perspective on that. So that's one thing I would say, and then I'm thinking about the STEM fields, the science, technology, engineering, mathematics fields are starting to do a lot of empirical conflict inquiry. There are 2 special issues recently in the last 5 years in Science magazine and in Nature. So this is becoming such a, sort of globally prioritized agenda item that now sci-tech talent is being put on some of these questions. And I think we should think about what that means. I think it's important for social scientists to think about, first of all, how to collaborate with STEM folks, and second of all, how to make sure that our research is not disparaged or marginalized because it is not neutral or empirical or cross-national kinds of research. So it's something to think about. That I'm not criticizing case studies, but I'm just saying that it's important when we do this more localized research to place it in the context of this burgeoning literature that is now a very cross-disciplinary literature. Yeah, I think I'll stop there because I'm sure I'm out of time. But I'm happy to take questions about any of these issues. And I did list all the data sets that are mobilized here, so if anyone's interested. Thank you very much.